Something extraordinary is happening in Washington right now, and it's not coming from the opposition. For the first time, Republicans themselves are pushing back against Donald Trump, quietly moving to block the power he's trying to hold on to at any cost. Emergency declarations, war-level rhetoric, and behind-the-scenes panic are colliding as Congress steps in to draw a line. This isn't just another political fight or a breaking news moment. It's a test of whether American power is ruled by law or by one man's instincts. Stay until the end because what's unfolding here could reshape how power works in the United States long after the headlines fade. Imagine this moment. Late at night in Washington. Phones lighting up across Capitol Hill. Aides whispering. Senators checking their screens twice to make sure what they're reading is real. Because the President of the United States is furious, not at Democrats, not at the media, but at his own party. And for the first time in a long time, the rebellion isn't coming from protesters outside the gates. It's coming from inside the walls. And that's where the real danger always begins. Because right now, Republicans are revolting against Donald Trump. And no, this isn't just the usual MAGA infighting or anonymous leaks meant to scare donors. This is something deeper, colder, and far more consequential because it cuts directly into the one thing Trump believes he cannot live without: unchecked power. The reason this revolt matters is not just that some supporters feel betrayed over broken promises. Whether it's the vow of no new wars or the soaring cost of living, or the lingering unanswered questions surrounding long-promised disclosures that never seem to arrive. It's that Republican lawmakers themselves are beginning to openly move against the very authority Trump is desperate to cling to. And when that happens, when the guardrails inside the system start to activate, presidents don't respond calmly. They escalate. They dramatize. They declare emergencies. And that's exactly what we're watching unfold right now. At the heart of this entire revolt is a simple but terrifying reality that even seasoned Washington veterans are struggling to process out loud. The President of the United States has been publicly entertaining the idea of using military force in ways that could drag America into conflict not with some distant adversary, but with its own allies. When Senator Chris Murphy laid this out in blunt terms, it landed like a shockwave. Because once you strip away the bluster and the branding, what you're left with is a scenario that sounds absurd until you remember we've stopped being allowed to dismiss these statements as jokes. Greenland is not a blank space on a real estate map. It is part of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally. And NATO's core principle is collective defense, meaning that any military action against that territory isn't just symbolic. It's a legal and strategic nightmare that theoretically places the United States in direct conflict with Europe. The fact that lawmakers are now having to seriously explain this to the public is itself a sign of how unmoored the conversation has become. Because no one in America voted for a presidency that risks a shooting war with allies over land acquisition rhetoric. And yet here we are, parsing comments, weighing hypotheticals, and watching members of Trump's own party quietly but firmly try to shut the door before it's kicked open. This is where Trump's worldview becomes critical to understanding the backlash. He doesn't process geopolitics as alliances or treaties or shared security obligations. War, authority, and constitutional boundaries. Faced with pushback, Trump doesn't retreat. He reframes. He reaches for the language of emergency, declaring extraordinary measures not just as policy tools, but as political weapons. The declaration of a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil assets fits perfectly into this pattern. It allows him to cast himself as the sole protector of national security, while portraying dissenting lawmakers as obstacles, even though the underlying reality is far more complicated, involving long timelines, massive corporate interests, uncertain infrastructure, and benefits that would flow primarily to multinational energy companies rather than ordinary Americans. But complexity has never been the point. The point is dominance, distraction, and control of the narrative. Because emergencies change the rules. Emergencies centralize authority. And emergencies shift attention away from uncomfortable questions. And there are few questions more uncomfortable for this administration right now than why long-promised transparency efforts have stalled, why document releases have been delayed, and why it took bipartisan pressure rather than executive initiative to move certain oversight actions forward. When lawmakers like Sheldon Whitehouse start talking openly about Inspector General compliance failures and unanswered timelines, it signals something important. Not a conclusion, not an accusation, but concern that process itself has broken down. And that concern is exactly what Trump cannot afford. What we were watching now is not just a disagreement over foreign policy, but a slow-motion stress test of American democracy under a leadership style that confuses escalation with strength and visibility with control. The Greenland rhetoric has crossed a threshold where it no longer functions as background noise. It has become a signal, both to allies and to domestic audiences, that restraint is no longer the default setting of power. Behind closed doors, Republicans are asking themselves whether stopping Trump is an act of betrayal or an act of preservation. Because history doesn't remember who tweeted the loudest. It remembers who stepped in when the rules were bending past their breaking point. This revolt, quiet in some places, explosive in others, may be the first real sign that the internal guardrails are finally being tested. Not by the opposition, but by those who know exactly how dangerous unchecked power can become when it's wrapped in grievance, spectacle, and the language of permanent emergency. As this internal rebellion deepens, the real story shifts from what Donald Trump is saying publicly to what Republicans are doing privately. Because behind the cameras, behind the social media outrage and the carefully worded statements, there is a growing recognition among GOP lawmakers that they are no longer dealing with a conventional presidency. They are dealing with a leader who sees every institutional limit as a personal insult. And that realization is changing behavior in ways that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. Because when the War Powers Resolution advanced with Republican votes, it wasn't an accident or a momentary lapse in party discipline. It was a calculated move by senators who understand that once the executive branch normalizes unilateral military threats, especially toward allied territory, Congress becomes irrelevant unless it reasserts itself. The future doesn't hinge on one person or one clip. It hinges on whether citizens insist that the office demands more than presence, more than performance, more than praise. Whether they insist on focus, coherence, and accountability as non-negotiable standards. Because the health of a system is measured not by how it performs under ideal conditions, but by how it responds when stress reveals its weaknesses. And what we saw was stress revealing adaptation rather than correction, containment rather than confrontation. This is the moment where power meets its limits, and the world is watching to see whether those limits still mean something.